The event will begin momentarily.
Dr. Pablos Mendez, welcome, and you're welcome to begin today's events.
Thank you very much. Good day and welcome everyone to this webinar on fighting pandemics. I am Dr. Ariel Pablos Mendez, founder and board member of the TB Alliance, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary in a year in which the world is ravaged by pandemics. Just yesterday, 1,000 COVID deaths were reported in the United States. This is an urgent moment. For those who may not be familiar, the TB Alliance is a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing new treatments against tuberculosis, the leading infectious killer in the world. Tragically, COVID, which didn't exist a year ago, may be in a position to match or surpass tuberculosis as infectious killer this year. I am a primary care physician in New York and have treated patients suffering from COVID-19 as well as those with MDR-TB, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. I have seen firsthand how deadly these diseases are and the threats they pose to global health and stability. But I also see signs of hope, not only in the many heroic responders, and I'm so proud to be a health professional, but in the form of new treatments and vaccines. One encouraging example is the new TB drug, predominant, developed by the nonprofit TB Alliance and approved last year by the US Food and Drug Administration. Today, the TB Alliance partner Mylan is announced that predominant will be approved for use in India, has been approved, and that means access to the world's country with the world's highest burden of tuberculosis. It will be used as part of the 3-drug, all oral, 6 months regimen for highly drug-resistant forms of the disease with a 90% treatment success rate as reported in the New England Journal of Medicine this year. Progress is possible against these infectious diseases. But it took years of work and investment. It was in February 2000 that the Rockefeller Foundation convened a group of stakeholders after 50 years with no new TB drugs to fight a problem that was only magnified by the AIDS epidemic. We gathered in Cape Town and issued a declaration calling for the establishment of a global alliance for TB drug development. And it was this week, 20 years ago, that the TB Alliance was incorporated. We have made significant progress, but so much more needs to be done if we are to end tuberculosis and other pandemics in our lifetimes. We are witnessing the devastating economic impact of infectious diseases on our world, as well as what true political will can look like with a global response and investments in new treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. And this brings us to the questions at the heart of today's event. What lessons can we learn from past successes and failures in developing new drugs and vaccines for devastating infectious diseases? How do we effectively organize investments in research and development and global collaboration for product development and equitable access? And how do we transform those lessons into concrete actions and outcomes against COVID-19 or major pandemics like tuberculosis? And how do we prevent future ones? To address these questions, we are really honored to have Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Soumya Swaminathan with us. And I look forward to joining the panel for an enlightening conversation. Allow me to introduce Betsy Mckay of the Wall Street Journal, who will be moderating today's discussion. Betsy.
Thank you, Dr. Pablos Mendez. It's great to be here. So as he said, we have a couple of guests. We're honored to have Dr. Anthony Fauci, who sort of needs no introduction, but the director of the National Institute of Infectious appointment on the coronavirus response or the science of it, and a household name now. And Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who's chief scientist of the World Health Organization. We're hoping to stream later. Dr. Fauci and I are going to talk for a bit now. A bit of a chat here. Dr. Fauci, thanks for being here.
Betsy, you're breaking up a lot. I really can't hear what you're saying. I'm sorry. Is that the same for everybody else? Yeah.
Can everybody hear me?
Well, now you're fine, but before you were breaking up a lot. So I didn't hear what you said to me. Sorry.
Well, I just introduced you, and please, everybody, let me know if I'm breaking up again. I've had a few problems here this morning with the connections. But Dr. Fauci, let's start with laying the groundwork here on COVID-19. Where are we in our odyssey with this virus? Or since everybody asks you about baseball, what inning are we in, and what's the score?
Well, if we are certainly not at the end of the game. I'm not even sure we're halfway through. I mean, obviously, and if you want to do a score, I don't want to get too cute about it, but certainly we are not winning the game right now. We are not leading it. If you look at the burden of infections globally and deaths, which, almost 600,000, and as Ariel said, threatening to even overtake tuberculosis this year as the leading cause of infectious diseases, death. It is really, as I've said often, and I don't mean to be melodramatic about it, Betsy, but it is really an infectious diseases person, a public health person, almost your worst nightmare. It's the perfect storm. We often talk about outbreaks and pandemics, be they influenza or other pathogens, that have to have a few characteristics that make them particularly formidable. Well, this particular virus has that. It jumps species from an animal reservoir to a human. It's a new virus, no background immunity that we know of. It is a respiratory-borne virus. It has two characteristics that really are very, very compellingly imposing. One, it's spectacularly efficient in spreading from human to human. And two, it has a substantial degree of morbidity or mortality, particularly in certain populations of people, such as the elderly and those with underlying conditions. So the status, in direct answer to your question, is we are living right now through a historic pandemic outbreak. And we are right now in a situation where we do not see any particular end in sight for the following reason, and then I'll stop and continue with you, is that countries like the United States have gotten hit very hard. The United States has actually gotten hit harder than any other country from the standpoint of number of cases and deaths per country. However, the thing that is somewhat concerning is that we all try to open up, not only in the United States, but other countries, to reopen your country again for economic and other reasons. And we have found, as we're experiencing right now in the southern states, that as you do that, we're seeing resurgences of cases, which means we've got to do much better in controlling the outbreak in general, but also particularly as we try to reopen.
So do you think long-term, is this virus here to stay now? And if so, what will it be like? I mean, is this going to be something that we're doing battle with every season, like the flu? Will it have the same type of mortality? And when you think of, your long history with HIV and TB, what do you see COVID-19 looking like in the lineup of infectious diseases? Is it going to be our worst killer now, or where will it land?
No, it's difficult to predict, Betsy, but I would say that I don't think it ultimately is going to be our worst killer, because so many people have asymptomatic infection, 20 to 45% of people, it certainly is a killer of those who are the senior citizens and those with underlying conditions. Occasionally, you have an exception. We have a perfectly young, healthy person has very serious disease and died. That's a minority of that. Mm-hmm. But I don't see this disappearing the way SARS-1 did. The reason I say that is that it is so efficient in its ability to transmit from human to human that I think we ultimately will get control of it. I don't really see us eradicating it. I think with a combination of good public health measures, a degree of global herd immunity, and a good vaccine, which I do hope and feel cautiously optimistic that we will get. I think when you put all three of those together, I think we will get very good control of this. Whether it's this year or next year, I'm not certain. But I think ultimately, with a combination of good public health measures and a vaccine, that we may not eradicate it, but I think we will bring it down to such a low level that we will not be in the position that we're in right now for an extended period of time.
Do you think it would morph over time into something like a common cold, like other coronaviruses have, or not? Or is it just hard to know?
You know, it's hard to know. It would have to do some changing either on the part of the virus or on the part of the human species, because the one thing that is very clear, that in some people who have underlying conditions and maybe other factors that we are not fully appreciating, be they genetic or otherwise, I'm not sure, but I have never seen an infection in which you have such a broad range of literally nothing, namely no symptoms at all in a substantial proportion of the population, to some who get ill with minor symptoms, to some who get ill enough to be in bed for weeks and have post-viral syndromes, and others get hospitalized, require oxygen, intensive care, ventilation, and death. I mean, the spectrum of involvement with the same pathogen is very unique. So, I mean, I don't really see this as all of a sudden morphing into a common cold where everybody just gets sniffles and nobody gets seriously ill. I just don't see that happening.
So what have you learned, or what lessons do you think can be learned from many years of research to develop tuberculosis treatments, vaccines? You know, now we've got a new drug that the TB Alliance has, pritomanid. You know, do you bring any lessons from, or what lessons do you bring from your experience there to something like this?
Well, there are a couple of lessons. The first lesson I think that we all know, because I think we have all been around long enough to see several unanticipated outbreaks. And that is that outbreaks of new infectious diseases occur. They always have occurred. They are occurring right now. We're in the middle of one, and they will always occur, no matter how good we are. So the lessons you learn is you've got to prepare the fundamental basic and clinical research, as well as the public health endeavors, to know that you should anticipate that you will be confronted with novel infectious diseases as we go on. There's no doubt about that. History has proven that time and again. With regard to the development of drugs, I think one of the things we've learned, at least in the arena of vaccinations, is that even between outbreaks, you can improve your capability of responding by developing better platform technologies. I mean, if you look, I think that COVID-19 is a beautiful example. The ability of multiple companies and multiple factions to get together and develop vaccines, which literally vaccine development began within days of the publishing of the sequence in the public database. We started a phase 1 trial 62 days following the beginning of vaccine development, and many candidates, at least a handful or more, in the next several months will be going into phase 3 trials, one of which will start at the end of this month. There's already one going on in Brazil and South Africa, the Oxford chimp ad. And then there are others in the next month, 2, 3, or 4 months from now, will be going into clinical trials that are phase 3. That is unprecedented. So I think that's the lesson you learn. If you concentrate on, by fundamental good science, increasing your capability, like perfecting platform technologies, I think will go a long way, as well as drug development, the same sort of thing.
How fast do you think you could, if and when you do perfect platform technologies and get a little further along than we were when this pandemic began, ideally, how fast can you get a vaccine developed for a novel pathogen that is causing a major epidemic or outbreak? I mean, can you catch the first wave, or can you just not do it that fast? Well,
I mean, I don't think you can if it's a brand new pathogen. I mean, if it's a brand new pathogen, the thing that we did at extraordinary speed was to go from the identification, which in the form of the sequence, which became public, to actually developing a vaccine, even with a platform that's so quick as mRNA, which isn't the only platform. There are several platforms that are novel platforms. But even with that, it still took, a period of time, 62 days, to be able to at least get a phase 1 trial. And if you want to do it correctly, with safety and real attention to safety and efficacy, I think we are going as fast as we possibly can. The speed of getting the result will always be determined by the degree of infectious activity that you have. In other words, if you can get that vaccine trial going in the middle of a lot of viral activity, such as we are experiencing now in the United States with 50 to 60 to 70,000 new infections per day, that's bad news for public health, but that certainly facilitates the development and the proving of the efficacy of a vaccine. So I think, Betsy, we are going as quickly as we possibly can now, within the reign of, not jumping over important steps.
I imagine, you have no shortage of subjects for these vaccine trials. Do lots of people want to participate?
They do. We have that Coronavirus Prevention Network, COVE-PN, and we have a public database that people can sign up. We have well over 100,000 people that have already signed up as volunteers. So I think we'll be fine with regard to getting enough people. In the first trial, is going to be 30,000 people in the trial, and they're going to be more than one trial. So you're talking about tens and tens of thousands of people that will be needed for these multiple vaccine trials.
And, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of studies about immunity and durability. How long do you think the vaccines will protect, a vaccine?
Impossible to tell right now. We know that infection with coronaviruses in general, and even some early data with the durability of the response following recovery from COVID-19, that the duration is not measured in the kinds of things we see with measles, which is essentially lifetime. I would be really surprised. I don't know exactly how long it's going to be. Some early studies say several months to a year or more. I hope it's more than that. But if it isn't, then we'll have to obviously adjust to the situation by booster shots.
Are antibodies or T cells, do you think, more important when it comes to how protective vaccines are going to be?
Well, the gold standard, as we know, for viruses such as this, neutralizing antibodies. So I think they're going to be clearly important. There's always some debate about the role of T cells. I believe, as an immunologist, that T cells do play an important role. They may not be the dominant role in protecting against infection, but they certainly, because of the nature of what T cell immunity is, they are at least important in recovery from infection, if not necessarily from protection from infection.
Okay. So the FDA gave a 50% efficacy benchmark, right, for COVID-19 vaccines. So what do you think about that benchmark? Is that good enough? I mean, is that going to give people confidence that these vaccines work and that they should get them, particularly when we have, sort of vaccine skepticism in general out there?
Well, we certainly would like to see an efficacy that's higher than 50%. I mean, I think in terms, as a immunologist, vaccinologist, infectious disease person, I like to see it upwards of 70+%. I mean, it would be wonderful if we had a measles-like vaccine. I'm not sure we'll get that. That's 97 to 98% effective. But I mean, I think that a 50% would be acceptable, though I would love to see something, at least as high as 70 to 75%. Remember, if you look at the efficacy of influenza vaccines, generally on a reasonable year, it's 40 to 50%, sometimes even less. In other populations, maybe as high as 60, but 40 to 50 or plus for influenza generally is considered acceptable. So I can understand how 50% for COVID-19 would be acceptable. But again, we're shooting for something higher than that.
Okay. And in terms of safety, because you talked about that a little bit, but let's go back to it. What's being done to make sure that vaccines are going to be proven safe when they're being developed so quickly?
Well, I mean, obviously, phase 1 data gives you immediate safety.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily give you all the parameters of safety. Phase 2 gives you more. But what we will do as we go into phase 3, which is fundamentally efficacy to see if it works in the field, as there are infections that are out there, we also are going to pay a special attention to certain safety elements during the phase 3 trial. And one of the ones that we want to keep a special eye on is the possibility of vaccine-induced enhancement of infection. In other words, the paradoxical situation where you get vaccinated, you get infected, and the fact that you have been vaccinated with an inadequate level of suboptimal antibodies, that you could actually enhance the infection because you've been vaccinated. That's something we want to keep an eye out on, and we will during the phase 3 trials.
Yeah, how worried are you about that? Do you have any, particular reason at this point to believe that that's going to be a problem?
I don't have any particular reason to believe, but since we've seen this sort of thing in kind of in animal issues with SARS-1 and with MERS, that we want to pay attention to it. I don't use the word I'm worried about it. I mean, rather than worry, I try to do something about it.
And what hopes do you have for monoclonal antibodies as either a treatment or a passive vaccine? I mean, it looks like there've been some promising findings recently.
Well, we certainly, the idea of using monoclonal antibodies for a viral infection, I think the success that we had with 2 of these in Ebola, which was a randomized controlled trial in Ebola with both monoclonal antibody 114, which was developed here at NIH, and the Regeneron antibodies, gave me good optimism that we could do this with other viruses. So I feel cautiously optimistic that the monoclonal antibodies that are being developed and actually going into clinical trial right now for COVID-19, both for prevention and for treatment, is something we really want to keep our eye out on, because I think there's a reasonably good chance that they will turn out to be very much value added to our armamentarium.
Do you see a good treatment coming through earlier than a vaccine?
Yeah, I would think so, because we already have 2 treatments that are been shown in randomized placebo-controlled trials, which is, in my mind, the only way to really nail down whether something truly is effective. We know that dexamethasone for people on ventilators or on oxygen works to decrease significantly the death rate. Interestingly, it doesn't work for early infection, and in fact, maybe even be detrimental, which goes along with our concept of the pathogenesis, that you want to block the virus and keep the immune system intact early on, but you want to block inflammation later on, because that assumes a much greater role in pathogenesis. The other one is remdesivir, which was shown to have a modest but statistically significant effect on diminishing the time to recovery. What we really need, Betsy, is what you actually alluded to, was some good interventions that can be used early, that can prevent people from going into the hospital. In other words, to have, when someone gets symptomatic enough, to block that infection so you don't wind up getting people in the hospital and sometimes requiring intensive care. We need to focus on those early events when you first get symptoms.
So you're involved in all this work, but how much time, you have a lot of responsibilities right now. How much time do you actually have to spend in your quote unquote day job at NIAID versus your other responsibilities?
Well, because I work a 36-hour day, so it's easy. No, I don't.
Slept since January, right?
I don't mean to be facetious, but what I do is that the routine changes a bit, but what I do is I spend most of the morning with my team here at NIAID, and I'll work on vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics. And almost every day, I go down to the White House and meet with the coronavirus task force. Like today, I'm meeting with the group of doctors before the task force meeting, namely Debbie Birx and Bob Redfield and Steve Hahn and others. And then we have our coronavirus task force meeting with the vice president. I'll spend about an hour and a half there. And then I hang around the White House meeting with different people with regard to that responsibility. So it's almost a 50-50, half the day at the NIAID and half the day at the White House.
Before we turn it over to the next portion of our panel, I do want to ask you, you get no sleep. You've, as you said, you've been called a lot of names. You've been criticized lately. You've had to get personal security, and so forth and so on. I just wonder what keeps you from saying, thank you very much. This has been great. I'm going back to my day job now.
Well, I would never do that, Betsy. This is such an important public health challenge that we're facing, that this is what I do. This is what I've been doing all my life. This is what I've been trained for. This is what I have all my experiencing in. It would be unimaginable for me, no matter what they throw at me, with needing security or whatever it is. I'm not walking away from this because this is just too important. There's too much at stake for the world for me to walk away from this. Not a chance.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fauci. We're going to move to the next portion of the panel, and we'll be talking again during our panel discussion. So now, as I understand it, Dr. Swaminathan has a few remarks.
Thank you, Betsy. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to colleagues who are listening. And thanks a lot to Mel and Willow, Ariel from the TB Alliance. I should say that my first love is TB because I've been a TB researcher in India for most of my career, dealing, of course, with the HIV-TB co-infection issues and also TB in children before I became the head of the ICMR, the Indian Council of Medical Research, and then moved on to WHO to join Dr. Tedros's team in 2017. And what a time to be in WHO and what a responsibility, Betsy. The Division of Science was created last year. I'm the first chief scientist at the organization. And the idea really was to try and look ahead, be ahead of the curve, so to speak, develop a foresight function for the World Health Organization and anticipate technological, scientific developments and breakthroughs that might come in the next 5 to 10 years that could have big impacts, both on clinical medicine and on public health. And to be prepared not just for what those implications are and prepare for those, but also to look at the social, ethical, legal, and other aspects of these new technologies, because we know every new technology comes with its own ethical, social, and perhaps regulatory and legal challenges which need to be addressed. And the other goal of setting up the science division was really to provide a degree of quality assurance, even more rigorous quality assurance to all the normative work that we do. One of the things that I started thinking about as soon as we set up the science division was, what could WHO do to promote product development, especially for diseases where there is no big market? And this could be things like the diseases which are on our priority pathogens list: Ebola, Nipah, Marburg, other hemorrhagic fevers, also MERS. So you have those set of diseases which could be rare, but which could have really catastrophic outbreaks and epidemics. And there's another set of priority pathogens for which we do not have enough drugs in our armamentarium. And these are some of the gram-negative bacteria and gram-positive bacteria that have developed antimicrobial resistance, for which the world needs antibiotics. And then you have another set of diseases, which are the neglected diseases, or the so-called neglected tropical diseases, for which there isn't a market and there isn't much interest. And unfortunately, tuberculosis has been the victim of such neglect, except, of course, for the valiant efforts of the TB Alliance and a few other groups. So we decided that WHO could play an important role in product development by thinking about an end-to-end process. And what do I mean by that? It's thinking about, what do you need? What does the world need in terms of for public health impact? What is that product? Could we describe that? So we could do target product profiles, for example, which we did for Ebola vaccines. We've done it for COVID vaccines. That tells developers and funders what the profile of a product should be, whether it's a vaccine or a diagnostic. And then you have to, of course, then evaluate the products once they're developed. We could also provide feedback into the kind of trials that may be needed to test these products. We heard Dr. Fauci talk about the size of the trials that would be needed for doing a phase 3 vaccine trial. Unfortunately, quite often you see randomized clinical trials being done with small groups of individuals that lead to inconclusive results, and this doesn't really help anyone. So whether it's vaccines or drugs, you need well-conducted, preferably multi-centric, multi-country, if it's appropriate, randomized trials that answer the questions of efficacy and safety without reasonable doubt. And then you need all of the downstream work on the regulatory harmonization, on pre-qualification, on developing the guidelines for use, and then, of course, country implementation. And so WHO has a role to play actually at many of these steps of product development, except, of course, developing the product itself, which is mostly the work of the private sector, very often coming from academia, but then moving into the private sector. And so we have set up now a function, and where we're interacting with many of the product development partnerships, including the TB Alliance, on how we could facilitate, how the WHO could facilitate this type of product development. And the last thing I'd like to say is that we've seen such tremendous scientific collaboration in this pandemic, such tremendous global willingness to share data, share knowledge, share experiences, literally on a day-to-day basis, not worried about publications and so on, but doing it in the hope of helping us get better control of this. And if that same if that same philosophy and that same collaboration could go into developing drugs and vaccines for tuberculosis, of course, you also need the financial resources. So the kind of investments that are being made now by many countries around the world into developing new products, if that could also be harnessed for diseases like TB, for the other neglected diseases, I think we could make a lot of progress in vaccines and diagnostics and drugs for many of the diseases today for which we don't have these products, and where millions of people around the world are suffering and are dying, but outside the public eye, really. So we keep account on a daily basis of the number of COVID deaths. Unfortunately, we've little bit relegated to the background the deaths due to TB, the deaths due to HIV, the deaths due to malaria, that unfortunately our models suggest could all go up if we do not address the huge challenges that health systems are facing around the world and just delivering care to people who need them on a daily basis. Back to you, Betsy.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Swaminathan. You brought up a lot of interesting things. I mean, I wonder, we'll move now to the panel portion with everybody. I would like to start with you though, and Dr. Fauci. Do you think the political will and the money is now going to be, is the situation going to change as we move forward? Certainly there is a lot of interest in investment now. We're trying to get ourselves out of a pandemic, but what about, months and years down the road? Are we going to learn the lessons?
Well, I hope so, Betsy. One of the things that I've learned over the decades that I've been doing this is that we, for the most part, don't have very good corporate memory of things that you get through a crisis, and then you realize that you were not as well prepared as you should have been. And then between crises, it's very difficult to get people to allocate resources for something that might happen when you have competing priority of things that are happening. And we have found that even, in our own experience here with pandemic preparedness. So I do hope that with all the pain and suffering that the world is going through now with COVID-19, that we do not forget that when we get through this, which we will get through it, that we know that it will happen again. It certainly will. And that's the reason that I think we really need to push to have a sustained commitment, because emerging infections will continue to occur long after we're all gone. So let's prepare for them.
Dr. Swaminathan, did you have any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with Dr. Fauci. I do hope the same spirit continues. As you know, we launched something called the ACT Accelerator. It's Access to COVID Technologies Accelerator, which brought together several global agencies, including agencies like the Global Fund, Gavi, CEPI, UNITAID, FIND, with the WHO, with the World Bank, with UNICEF, and several donor countries to accelerate not just the development of new tools, but also allow for the affordable and equitable access to these products to populations around the world. There's been an amazing amount of solidarity behind this, a lot of political will, and some funding, not enough, but I hope that will come. And we've had amazing discussions with member states about how such an equitable access framework could actually work, where it's not what happened in the 2009 H1n1 pandemic, that the limited supplies of the vaccine were cornered by a few high-income countries who had pre-booked the doses. And most of the low and middle-income countries were left way behind. If the pandemic had turned out to be worse than it was, it would have been a dreadful situation for the world to have been in. We do not want to be in that situation. We're doing everything possible to avoid that. And I do hope, but like Dr. Fauci said, memories are short. Human beings tend to forget. Once you're through the pain, you move on. I hope we learn some lessons from COVID to apply to some of the other diseases, particularly those that impact poor and neglected populations around the world.
Do you think, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is COVID-19 going to overtake TB as the largest infectious disease killer? I imagine temporarily it could.
Temporarily, it could. I hope not. I hope not. Death rates are stabilizing around the world, and I hope they don't go up the way case rates are going up. But in the long run, TB is going to be with us. Malaria's with us for the foreseeable future, and so is HIV, though we're making progress in all of these. And so we have many, many infectious disease killers still around, still killing men, women, and children. And I hope in a year or two that we'll be over the acute phase of the pandemic, bring COVID to a manageable disease, whether it's through a vaccine and other public health measures, through building immunity. I'm worried about the other diseases, frankly. And what's happening really, we don't know. And we already know there may be shortages of antiretroviral drugs in many countries. Those can have devastating consequences for populations around the world.
I want to ask all of you a question because we're gathered here by the TB Alliance. And the TB Alliance developed Pretomanid. Do you see a model in the way it was developed and tested for more drugs for other diseases? In other words, a combination regimen that's tested and evaluated together. Is that something that could be done for COVID or other diseases? Do all of you think going forward? Whoever wants to start. Dr.
Clearly, tuberculosis has traditionally been a disease that is treated with multiple drugs in combination. And in fact, this was one of the lessons that we also applied to HIV, AIDS, and to other challenges where resistance may be a concern. But in addition to the way in which the regimens are put together, it is very important that to develop a drug or a vaccine, it takes a village. It takes many players from everywhere in the world, in a way, and from all sectors. If you go back to the 19th century, when the germ theory began to give us a logical way to approach with science systematically the development of new vaccines and antibodies, serum, and so on, and eventually antibiotics, that was at that time mostly a public sector enterprise, serum institutes in Europe and so on. Eventually, through the World War I and II, private sector industry emerged and became really a giant enterprise that adopted the science or systematic approach to development of drugs and vaccines. And by the 1960s, we had a lot of those bullets in our armamentarium. And some people thought we had it done. We just had to implement and forget about doing new science and research in those diseases. That wasn't true, obviously. And we paid the price of that. Even in New York, when I arrived for my training here in the 1980s, we were in the midst of both AIDS and tuberculosis and drug resistance, and we didn't have the bullets to fight them. So clearly, as Dr. Fauci has pointed out, we need to be prepared. WHO has put a framework for some of that work. But in the end, we need to work with the private sector that has expertise and know-how, especially in the late stage of development and regulations, as well as, of course, manufacturing and distribution. And the Global Alliance, the TB Alliance, was an example of a new cadre of organizations, of public-private partnerships that drew of the science that the NIH and WHO and many other organizations are putting out, but also to bring together the expertise of the private sector inside these non-profit virtual R&D enterprises to accelerate the development of those diseases neglected by markets, because markets were more interested in chronic diseases. I think there's a better understanding now of the importance of both, and efforts like CEPI, and clearly the NIH is always there because it costs a lot of money. And so especially the basic science to get us to where we need to be to identify targets and develop drugs and vaccines. So I believe it takes a lot of pieces to put together a regimen, a lot of pieces to put together a new compound. But I think the TB Alliance and other public-private partnerships that back then Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, but now many governments are supporting, and more importantly, the governments where the burden is greatest. I think the BRICS countries, increasingly, the treatment of tuberculosis itself and the fight against health problems as a whole is being driven by their own resources, but also by their own capacity. They have leadership, and we need to support the capacity for public health and the capacity for science and technology everywhere in the world, because we never know where the next virus will jump from.
Right. Let's move to a couple more questions before we move to our Q&A. And just a reminder, if anyone has a question, they haven't sent it in, please send it in and we'll get to them in a few minutes. I wanted to come back and ask how the US withdrawal from the WHO affects, or do you think will affect, the WHO's or global efforts in research and development of new products and cooperation. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Swaminathan, I'd love to hear what you have your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, since the United States gives such a large amount of money, I think that's going to be very disruptive to the activities of the WHO. So I hope somehow that gets worked out so that we don't go down that path.
Do you still, I mean, how can the U.S. support or lead these international efforts to step up research? I mean, you know, despite what we're doing here, do you see us still as being in a position to lead research and development, despite the relationship with the WHO or the lack of relationship?
Well, I mean, Sumya is much better positioned to comment on this than I. But you know, I mean, the synergy between what we do at the NIH, which is fundamentally basic and clinical research to understand diseases and to develop countermeasures, is very synergistic with the broad global and public health capability of the WHO, and it works in partnership and has worked. I mean, it's not a perfect organization. There have been mistakes over the years, but it's a very necessary organization. So, I mean, I think it's something that if we fine tune it, it can continue to and even be better tool against these kinds of outbreaks. But I'd be happy to hear Sumya's perspective on that.
Yes, Dr. Swaminathan, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the United States is one of the strongest partners that WHO has. They've been from the beginning of WHO. So over the last 70 years, there's been a strong technical collaboration with the various institutions in the United States, notably the NIH, the CDC, the FDA, and others. And on the one hand, of course, it's the financial resources that the United States provides. And through the WHO, it supports programs that range from polio eradication to immunization programs to neglected tropical diseases, tuberculosis. In fact, one of the biggest supporters of TB is the United States, HIV/AIDS. So they cover a broad range of programs, and therefore, of course, all of these programs will take a hit, and we're particularly worried about things like polio. But I think even more, it's really the strong technical collaboration, and as Tony said, there are complementarities between the scientific expertise and resources and infrastructure that is present in the United States and the work of WHO, ranging all the way from, I mean, today we're focusing on product development, but from surveillance to, public health strategies, to dealing with neglected diseases in all different corners of the world. So I think there are 80 collaborating centers in the United States, 80 WHO collaborating centers, the largest, and no other country has so many. So it's so intertwined, so interlinked, the work that we do. It's really hard to imagine, what it would be like without. And I sincerely hope, as Tony said, that can continue, because I think it would be a terrible loss for the world, really, if we lose those links and those collaborations. And as I said, it's some of the most neglected diseases and neglected populations, again, that might end up bearing the brunt of something like that.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to some Q&A now. I have a question here for Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci, when we beat this back, how can we leverage today's unprecedented amount of funding and political will for COVID-19 to tackle the big three and meet the sustainable development goals? Or are those goals unrealistic now?
When you say the big three, are you talking about HIV, TB, and malaria?
I'm assuming so.
Okay. Well, yes. We, as you know, and as was just mentioned, we put a substantial amount of resources into all three of the big three. The NIH is the largest funder of R&D in tuberculosis. If you look at the PEPFAR program for HIV, it's just extraordinary, together with the Global Fund, in which we put 1/3 of all the world's resources, as well as malaria, in which we have a substantial, but the President's Malaria Initiative that was started during George W. Bush's administration. I would hope that the amount of resources that we are now putting into the response to COVID, they're not just specific resources for this, it's the building of the kind of infrastructures that I think could be applicable to those other of the big three, as you call them. So I think resources that are put in for one particular disease very often builds capacity, builds intellectual infrastructure, as well as physical infrastructure that can be applied to other diseases. We've seen that very, very clearly in the money that has gone into the PEPFAR program, that is now using PEPFAR capabilities for things like maternal child health, for measles vaccination and others. So they all are fungible, as they say. You can help one by investing in the other.
We've got a question here about some countries like South Africa are jointly testing for COVID-19 and TB using the same diagnostics platform, Expert, portable digital X-ray. Why are more countries not doing this? And what can be done to encourage more proactive screening campaigns like this that test for both at once?
If I may, on that, Dr. Tedros invited me to share their strategy and technical advisory group for tuberculosis. And indeed, in the discussions on the interface between the two, there are many programmatic challenges, yes, but also opportunities. The national TB programs have been platforms to help respond in many of the countries. So far in Africa, the COVID has not been as bad as in other regions like Latin America. And clearly the TB platforms have been a good investment. One of the breakthroughs in the last decade for MDR-TB fight against multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis was the development of the Gene Expert, a small machine that you can deploy in the field to test for drug resistance with a quick turnaround. And that genetically based sort of test has now been adapted, as you just said, to be used to testing for PCR for COVID. And I think such ingenuity is important of the infrastructure that exists. And it's not just in South Africa, it's now been adopted in other places. And I think that we want to see more of that synergy between these two particular entities, but more as well in the future. We certainly hope that the investments in COVID infrastructure capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to COVID pandemics can be then sustained to help with other pandemics as well.
Okay. Another question for Dr. Fauci. You've spoken a lot about the technical and scientific aspects of COVID-19. What about leadership? It appears that countries with clear and consistent leadership achieve better results. Is there a plan to develop pandemic leadership training and to encourage better cooperation between public health and political leaders?
Betsy, the first half of your thing was the cracking up again. I'm sorry. Could you, I think when you move back and forth, that happens. Just stay in the same spot.
Okay. The question is about leadership. What about leadership? The countries with clear and consistent leadership have achieved better results. So is there a plan to develop pandemic leadership training and to encourage better cooperation between public health and political leaders?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a very complicated question because it really depends on what political leaders that you're talking about. You know, obviously you want to optimize your response by having a very close relationship between the political leaders and the individuals who are responsible for the public health, because they really need to support each other in any endeavor. So obviously it's a simple answer to the question. I mean, I don't know if you can train political leadership because political leaders change according to elections. So it's kind of tough. I think what we can say is that the fundamental principle of having a unified approach so that the political leadership supports the public health approach is obviously optimal.
Thank you, and sorry for my bad, my poor connection here. A question I think that's for Dr. Swaminathan, which is, what about the impact of COVID-19 on resource-limited countries? Are we ignorant of the impact while we're so involved in the problems of the global north?
Well, we're extremely worried about the impact on the poorer countries. As you say, we've seen this pandemic really move through continents, move through countries, and we've all, sat up in shock to see the high-income countries and the way this has impacted them. But they were able to implement these lockdowns, shelter-in-place policies, and so on, in order to reduce the transmission to a level that's low enough for them to then start opening up. The same doesn't apply, unfortunately, to low and middle income countries. Just because of the density of population, because of the informal nature of the work, because so many people rely on daily wages to get their food on the table. And the fact that many people don't have the kind of homes that you might expect people to self-isolate in. So there are innumerable problems. And I'm thinking about especially the big metropolises, the big densely populated urban cities in Africa and Asia. But we've still seen success stories in Africa and Asia where countries and governments have done the right thing and have been able to keep it under control. This has been also at enormous cost. And the cost has been because of the lockdowns, the loss of livelihoods. We've got now, estimates that poverty and undernutrition and hunger are going to increase this year, that there's going to be a setback towards many of the attainment of the SDG goals, even things that were on track, things like childhood immunization, maternal and child mortality rates, progress in HIV, TB, malaria, they're all under threat now because of this disruption to health services. And particularly when you have a limited workforce, limited resources, in many cases, you do not have, the intensive care units and the tertiary hospitals to take care of sick people. It puts a tremendous strain on the system. On the other hand, I must say that countries in Africa, I think, have shown a lot of resilience. And this is possibly because of their approach to diseases like HIV, which have been very, very much community-based and community-led approaches. And I think that's an important element of success of those countries that have shown success, has been the fact that there's been trust between government and communities, that there's been community engagement, participation, good communication from leaders, and of course, sound public health policies. So I think WHO has been highlighting the fact that in addition to managing COVID, we need to pay attention to the other health services which have been disrupted, chronic diseases, mental health. All of these have suffered as a result of the disruption. And the only way out is to invest in health systems, invest in universal health coverage, invest in primary health care. And I hope, again, as you said earlier, Betsy, about the lessons learned from this pandemic, I think those countries that have done well are those which have invested in institutions, in building public health capacity and cadres, and in being close to communities and involving communities from the beginning. Okay. And I hope those lessons will continue to be applied. In addition to financial investments in health systems, I think the way we build these are also important.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, can't get to the other questions. I'm very sorry about that. I just want to thank all our participants for taking part. I apologize for my audio challenges, and I want to thank everybody who has tuned in. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Pablos Mendez for some closing comments.
Well, thank you, Betsy, really. And as Dr. Fauci said, although maybe rather than baseball, I would use a soccer or cricket metaphor for the rest of the world. We are really half-time. We're not near the end of this pandemic. We certainly hope we can learn, because COVID has reminding us of the imperative to fight infectious diseases like tuberculosis and others. And as we just heard through this discussion, we certainly hope a vaccine will arrive soon and is accessible to everybody who needs it in the world. I also believe that there will be some immunity built up among the millions and millions of patients who have already been exposed and been infected by COVID. Meantime, we know what works. Stay home for those who are most vulnerable, safe distance, wearing a mask, washing your hands. And certainly we continue to work in the science and technology for new tools. And I would like to say also that for the future, we need to also invest in that. And I have been associated with something called the Global Virome Project, an effort to try to identify the 99% of the virus in tropical regions of the world that already live in mammals that could jump into humans. And I think we need to go beyond the current paradigms of technological resources to ideas such as that. The TB Alliance will be publishing an event summary on our website, and I hope we can continue the conversation in the hashtag Fighting Pandemics. So out of time now, on behalf of the TB Alliance, thanks to our guests, thanks to all of you again for your time and attention, and let's keep out the fight.